close in on Flagstaff Pulliam airspace. Next step is setting up to enter the traffic pattern. We've got clearance to enter the downwind leg and land on runway 21. Keep your attitude, then follow the standard pattern. To a cruise attitude and reduce your power. Should be at idle now, so you're losing altitude while maintaining cruise attitude. A landing on runway 21, and we'll call this one done. VFR flight in the books. Not bad. Not bad at all. Are you ready for this? You are going solo on a full VFR flight. You'll be departing Flagstaff Pulliam Airport, handling every navigational step on your way to Sedona. From takeoff to touchdown, it's all you. Don't worry though, even if I'm not with you in the cockpit, I'm always with you in spirit.
Bank angle, bank angle.
Sink rate, sink rate. Pull up, pull up.
Warning. Missile launch. Warning.
Climb, climb, climb.
Altitude. Altitude.
Are you ready for this? You are going solo on a full VFR flight. You'll be departing Flagstaff Pulliam Airport, handling every navigational step on your way to Sedona. From takeoff to touchdown, it's all you. Don't worry though. Even if I'm not with you in the cockpit, I'm always with you in spirit. not what was expected. At this point, I think it's probably best if we start the lesson over.
Welcome to Pre-Pilot for this.
Everyone, these little drawings that might help you out on the written test, but make it more confusing when you get in the airplane. But if I can get you to understand just a few basic things, you'll see just how easy these VORs are to use and that you don't need them. These are two different things. When we talk about bearing, that's my position in relation to the position of something else. For example, let's say I wanted to identify my position off this VOR, and my airplane's down here. Now let's say if I want to fly to the station, I have to fly a course of 300, and that's a west-northwest course. 300 is my bearing to the station, and it doesn't matter what my heading is. The heading of my airplane could be turned all the way in the opposite direction, and my bearing to the station would still be 300 degrees. And that's because that's the course I need to fly in order to go to the station. With that in mind, sometimes you'll need to know your bearing from the station. If someone else had to fly from the station to your position, what course would they fly? In this example, the course from the station to my position is 120, so that's my bearing from the station. And once again, it does not matter what your heading is, it's the course that you would fly from the station to your position. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? VORs only give bearing to and from the station. They don't have anything to do with heading whatsoever. And understanding that, okay, so why they don't have telling you all this? VORs only give bearing to and from the station. They don't have anything to do with heading whatsoever. From the station to understanding that is the first step in making VORs easy to use. VOR stands for VHF Omnidirectional Range, and that VHF stands for Very High Frequency Radio. And that just means these things operate off of radio waves. And we use the NavAid radios in the plane to pick up that signal from the VORs. And in most planes, you tune these in just like you would the comm radios, meaning the radios we talk on.
So the first step in using a VOR is to tune the frequency in on the NavAid radios. So today, my frequency over here at Bartlesville is 117.9er. So I'll tune that in right here, 117.9er on the NavAid radios. 117.9er, and then I'll switch it over here to the active frequency. On this particular aircraft, this NavAid radio is tied to this VOR right here, and this NavAid radio is tied. On this particular aircraft, this NavAid radio, 117.9er, and then I'll switch it over here to the active frequency. On this particular aircraft, this NavAid radio is tied to this VOR right here, and this NavAid radio is tied into this one. This NavAid radio is tied to this VOR right here, and this NavAid radio is tied into this one.
Now that we've tuned in the frequency, we can make sure that we're on the right frequency one of two ways. Every VOR is coded with a 3-letter identifier. As you can see here, this one is Bravo Victor Oscar. On some newer aircraft, when you tune the frequency in correctly, these letters will also be displayed. On older aircraft like mine, you can actually turn the sound on your nav-aid radios and listen to this Morse code identifier right here. Now, I'm not saying that you need to learn Morse code. All I'm saying is that this is a great way to make sure that you're getting the right signal. Okay, so now let's talk about how these VORs work for just a second. These guys broadcast radio signals all the way around the station, and these radio signals are aligned with magnetic courses from the station. We call these individual radio signals radials, and there's 360 of them to match the 360 degrees on a compass. Sorry, I'm not going to draw all 360 of them for you here. I don't like you guys that much. Alright, pop quiz time. Let's say I'm flying my Cessna 172 out here, and I'm on top of the 070 radial. What's my bearing from the station? Remember, we said that these radials are aligned with magnetic courses from the station, so that would mean our bearing is 070 from the station. And now you're starting to see just how easy this is. But now comes the part that instructors don't explain too well. And because of that, everyone has a hard time with these things. All these radials only broadcast from the station. None of these radials broadcast to the station. Because of that, if I'm not here on the 090 radial from the station, I can't use this radial to fly to the station. I would have to pick one of these radials on the other side of the station and use that signal to fly to the station. And if you tune those radials in on the other side of the station, your airplane will actually sense those radials on the side you're on as well. And I'm going to simplify this even more for you in a second. But for now, I've got a memory aid for you. To go to the station, you must go through the station. And what I mean by that is to go through the station to a radial on the other side. And this memory aid can also be used to help you find your bearing to the station. For example, if I'm out here on the 060 radial, the radial on the opposite end of the station is 240. For my bearing to the station, I went through the station to 240. And it's really easy to come up with those reciprocals by either adding or subtracting 180, or just simply looking at the other side of your compass card. Alright, so now let's take a look at the to from indicator. We're going to use this guy to determine whether the course we selected is going to take us to the station or from the station. And to select a specific course, we can rotate this OBS knob on the course deviation indicator, or the CDI. Okay, so let's say I'm flying somewhere east of the station and I dial in the 090 radial. Would I get a to or a from indication? The answer is, you'll get a from indication, and that's because if you intercept and fly any of these radials on your side of the VOR, they'll take you away from the station. In fact, if you're within 90 degrees of that radial you have selected, you will always get a from indication. So that from indicator not only allows you to fly a course from the station, but you can also find your bearing from the station. Let's say I have the 110 radial dialed in. If I'm receiving a from indication and my CDI needle is centered, then I know for 100% fact that I'm on the 110 radial. Now don't worry, we'll talk a little bit more about the needle here in just a second. Now let's say I'm over here on the west side of the station, and I spin the 090 course back in my CDI. In this example, I should expect a to indication. Remember how I said earlier that there...
Welcome to what I believe to be used.
These questions might be on the lesson because if you have
that act on an airplane while it's in flight.
This is a super important lesson.
The four forces that act on an airplane while it's in flight.
This is a super important lesson because if you have a basic understanding of aerodynamics, this is going to give you a good foundation that you can start building on throughout your training. Plus, these questions might be on the written test. Oh, I didn't mention that there's a written test? Oh yeah, there's a written test, and you've got to pass it with at least a 70%. But don't worry, I got you. Anyway, let's take a look at these four forces that affect our airplane in flight. As you can see, these forces are lift, weight, thrust, and drag. Now the first force you should know about is lift. As you can see, this is the upward force that actually picks the aircraft up away from the ground. And this is caused by basically two things: relative wind and the wing design. Now we pilots have a super fancy name for this wing design. We call it an airfoil. But I don't want to go into too much detail on that right now because we're going to be talking about that in more detail in the next lesson. The next force we need to consider when flying an aircraft is weight. Now weight is simply the combined load of all the people on board the aircraft, all the fuel, any baggage or cargo you might have, and even the aircraft itself. It includes everything on board the aircraft. The other thing you should know about the weight is that it opposes lift and acts downward through the center of gravity. Now, we'll discuss the center of gravity more in an upcoming episode, but the center of gravity is basically where the average weight of the aircraft and everything on board is centered. If you could hang an airplane from a string and you were to place the center of gravity directly beneath the string, the aircraft would balance perfectly. Now, here's something that may not make a lot of sense yet, but it's important to know. In steady, unaccelerated flight, lift and weight are both equal, but we'll come back to that here in just a second. Next, we have thrust, and this is the force that propels our aircraft forward. Thrust is typically created by some kind of engine and propeller working together, or a rotor for you helicopter nerds out there. Now, the important thing to know about thrust is that in order to move the aircraft forward, you must first
Stargate. Put that name down in your books, because I think you're going to hear a lot about it in the future. A new American company that will invest $500 billion at least in AI infrastructure.
The data centers are actually under construction. The first of them are under construction in Texas, the Abilene location, which is our first location.
Abilene is a town on the western central plains of Texas. We kind of scratch and fight for everything good that comes our way.
I had people reaching out and they said, well, is the president going to come see you? And I said, well, he hasn't texted me yet, so.
I'm thrilled we get to do this in the United States of America. I think this will be the most important project of this era.
Welcome to Abilene, Texas. This is the site of Project Stargate, a very mysterious, much talked about, much speculated about project that brings together OpenAI, SoftBank, Oracle. If it all comes together, building after building on this red dirt behind me will be filled with chips that'll power the AI revolution.
What we're undergoing right now is sort of the largest infrastructure build in human history. It's going to create new ways of doing business, it's going to create new ways of invention, and it's going to really drive humanity forward.
I was in the real estate business. These buildings, these are big, beautiful buildings. They're going to employ a lot of people.
How do you personally grapple with the pace of it all?
It does feel like it's going very fast. I certainly think if I could
Why would you want to do something like that?
So the bullet bounces up, can I?
Well, you did shoot, and the bullet bounced off. You might accidentally hit someone else. We don't want that to happen.
No.
Why don't you just, you and I, here we go, right now. Just give me that, just hand me that.
You think I don't see what you're doing?